All right, let's move on to our fourth topic, and that is newcomers. And let's hear our question, and let's watch it on the big screen.
I'm Deacon Rudy Ovchak, Director of the Office for Refugees at the Archdiocese of Toronto, Canada's largest private refugee sponsor. We're here at the ORAT offices. Over the past decade, the Archdiocese of Toronto has welcomed more than 4,500 refugees to Canada. And this was only made possible by the generosity of many people who have given of their time, talent, and treasure to come to the aid of those who have had to flee from their homeland because of violence and persecution. The Catholic Church, along with many faith communities across the country, have led the way in private sponsorship of refugees, a program that has become the envy of the world. Yet it faces significant challenges. Our office sponsors refugees from many faith traditions, both Christian and non-Christian. However, I am deeply concerned that the United Nations, along with many Western governments, including Canada's, have done far too little to address the suffering of Christian refugees. As Carl Haytu has already told us, Christians are the most persecuted religious community in the world. Christians are being bullied, arrested, jailed, expelled, executed, and oftentimes the targets of genocide. This should have triggered an overwhelming response from the West. Yet in July, a report that was commissioned by the UK Foreign Secretary to examine Christian persecution found that the West has done little to address this issue. In fact, by all accounts, Christians are terribly underrepresented in refugee resettlement efforts undertaken by the West. My question is, what actions will your government take to ensure that there is justice and equity within Canada's refugee resettlement program, so that persecuted religious minorities, and in particular the Christian community, are not abandoned?
Thank you, Deacon Rudy. 1 minute each for the candidates. And Garnet, would you go first?
Well, thank you. Newcomers succeed when we welcome them into our own homes and communities. Government must play a role, but it's not for politicians to claim the limelight. So the question for this segment is how we can better support you in the work you know best and are already doing to welcome newcomers. The question is deeply personal for me because my grandmother was a refugee. Conservatives will lift caps, reduce wait times, and strengthen the support to private refugee sponsors. These refugees enrich the communities they join and have a demonstrably higher rate of success as a result of better community support. Over the last 4 years, unfortunately, the rhetoric on immigration has been out of step with reality. Sponsors, including this Archdiocese, have faced arbitrary cuts to their quota allocation along with new red tape. Vulnerable refugees who already have sponsors in hand can still be forced to wait for 3 years or more. In government, Conservatives supported communities in welcoming 240,000 legal immigrants every year. We also maintained high levels of public support for immigration. So it's time to get our system back on track.
Dan Turcotte from the Green Party. Dan.
I certainly agree. It's time to get our system back on track. And I also think that we need more immigration. And we're going to see a lot more refugees, not just because of unrest, but climate refugees. We're already starting to experience an influx of climate refugees, and believe me, that's not going to get any better if we don't address the climate crisis. Of course, I have to say that because I believe it wholeheartedly. You know, we're also going to need a lot more workers to handle green jobs as we transition our economy, and I know that seems to be a nasty word in some places, but we are going to have to transition our economy. We're on the verge of a new technological and industrial revolution right now, and we have to be ready for that. And those immigrants can actually help us with that workforce. So the Green Party feels that we need to expand immigration and we need to make sure that it is fair, absolutely. I'll just close by saying, because I'm out of time, that we as Canadians have so much, we have enough to share. So let's share, let's be kind.
Francis.
Thank you, Don. I'd like to first go back to say thank you to Cardinal Collins and everybody at the Archdiocese for their leadership on the Syrian refugee file. Again, that was a moment for Canadians to be proud of, and we continue to work to accept refugees coming to Canada, to integrate, to work, and to live a better life. One thing that I'm very proud of is the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative that our country took to train other countries in adopting refugee sponsorship programs. 6 countries have started to implement the refugee sponsorship program, and 12 other countries are working to adopt a similar model. We will be quadrupling the number of privately sponsored refugees to 20,000 by 2020, increase caps on SARs, or sponsorship agreement holders, to facilitate more private sponsorships. But we also have to ensure that the rhetoric, especially from the far right and the conservatives on this issue, is down. Refugees are our most vulnerable people in the world. We need to assist them where we can and help them. That is the Canada that I know. Thank you.
Matthew.
If you can hear the compassion in my voice when I talk about this topic, it's because it's personal. You see, my people were this country's first Christian refugees. My people were freedom seekers who walked the footpaths of the Underground Railroad and risked everything to follow that North Star to this promised land. The first refugees of this country. Canada has a long tradition at its best of being a welcoming place for those seeking refugees from war and violence and simply seeking a better life for themselves and their families. In a time when immigrants are demonized and targeted by violent rhetoric, we have the responsibility to welcome those who come to Canada with generosity and kindness. Our immigration system is largely a success story across the world, but we should end the safe third-party agreement to ensure that asylum seekers are treated fairly and respectfully here in Canada, and work to address the serious backlogs for family reunification.
David.
Thank you. I just want to show that it doesn't always have to be partisan up here. My Conservative colleague, when he says that we need to emphasize private sponsorship, that too is a policy that we have embraced in the People's Party because it does work very well. Churches and communities of faith have been phenomenal in sponsoring refugees, and we need to do more of that, and less of the government sponsorship, which actually doesn't work out. We also need to fix the refugee system generally. What people may not know is that Canada, since 2017, has brought in more refugees than any other Western country, even 10 times more than the United States. I'm sorry, that's wrong. More than the United States, that has 10 times our population. But my point is this: we have not focused on those who have been persecuted. 40% of the people who have come into Canada through Quebec have been rejected. 40%. We don't need people gaming the system. We need to treat those people who are really in fear for their lives. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, I asked you not to applaud, but I actually am enjoying you applauding. What I'm not enjoying, though, is there are some people in the audience who are flashing things and trying, it seems to me, to distract some of the candidates when they're speaking. They don't enjoy that, and I really don't enjoy it. And I doubt the Cardinal enjoys it either, although I haven't actually consulted with him. But I'm asking you now to please stop it. Now, let's go on with I want to talk about the private sponsorship of refugees. Private groups who want to sponsor refugees, what hand do they have in selecting who those refugees are, or do they basically just sponsor people that have gotten into the queue and we're moving the queue along faster because we have some private sponsorship? David, why don't you go first?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Well, currently we rely on the UN for many of the refugees that come to us. The People's Party government wants to make sure that we have instead aid groups on the ground who know the people that are coming to them, and they're going to be more intricate. What we want to do is make sure that we have face-to-face interviews with the people so that we can actually know what their story is. We want to be able to take a more personal approach. We also think that it's important that we get out of the UN Compact for global migration because it actually hamstrings Canada in its ability to make its own decisions.
So just yes or no, say this Archdiocese should have people where, in Africa or the Middle East, and they should be picking the people? When you said we should have people on the ground, is that what you meant?
What I mean is if the Archdiocese has people on the ground already, then we would leave it to their expertise.
Francesco, same question to you. Should private groups sponsor people that are already basically in the queue just to move the queue along faster, or should they be somehow in the selection process?
My understanding in working with ORAT and other private sponsorship agreement holders on the private sponsorship of refugees, they work all over the world. They have expertise, whether it's in Africa or the Middle East or, say, Myanmar, or in Iraq or Jordan, Lebanon, and they have expertise on the ground, and they have their numbers or their quota, if you want to utilize that word, where they can bring refugees to Canada, and they're great partners with the Canadian government, and they have been for decades.
Garnet, what would you do, what would a Conservative government do about the asylum seekers that show up on the Quebec border and basically just walk into the country? How do you feel about that?
Well, we think that's a problem. We think we need to focus on the world's most vulnerable refugees, who aren't necessarily those folks seeking asylum from upstate New York, which is why our approach would be to change the tone and make sure we're clear about the way our rules work. We would seek to renegotiate aspects of the Safe Third Country Agreement that encourage people to make crossings at dangerous points. And I think, we see some polarization on questions of immigration. Conservatives believe that we can manage the system better, that we can address the problems that exist in the system, and we can welcome more of the world's most vulnerable refugees through private sponsorship. And I wanted to just answer your earlier question about the process, because really there's a two-step screening process, right? The private sponsor groups will identify individuals who are vulnerable, and very often there's a personal connection. It might be through a diaspora community or some other connection that facilitates that welcoming and integration process. But then there's also a government review. So you have that extra review and that personal connection that facilitates integration, which is a much better way of ensuring success than the increase in asylum claims we've seen under the Liberals.
And there's also a very important point here. I rejected the framing of that question as though they just cross the border and walk into the country. That's not so. What they do is present themselves at the border to the RCMP, after which they are taken for indefinite detention until they're processed, without representation sometimes. So I don't want to give the audience here some view, this maple wash perspective, that people walk through the snow risking their limbs and are just welcomed with a Tim Hortons coffee and a welcome into the country. That's not how this works. They are not illegal.
I agree with you.
Excuse me, I need to finish this point.
Well, no,
they are not illegal.
I am moderating,
they are irregular.
and I think, speaking to your point, which is that they are detained and they are
you said welcomed
taken in. Well,
it's not a fair assessment, sir.
Okay. Well, I'm not running anywhere, and don't you think it's a pretty darn good thing I'm not? Dan, last word to you.
I'm going to keep my answer really short because I think a lot's been said here. One of my colleagues actually said that it's important that we reduce wait times. I think that's very, very important. I also think that a lot of the private sponsorship that happens is absolutely wonderful. My brother is a reverend, and he actually his church sponsored a number of Syrian refugee families and did some wonderful work, and I commend them for that. But I do think that it is our responsibility to make sure that the immigration process is fair, and so we need to look at where those refugees are in the most dire need, and we need to make sure that their immigration needs are being fairly represented, and we need the government to preside that in case private sponsorship doesn't cover all of that.